A blizzard was blowing across the Peak District when a call came in that a prisoner had attacked 2 prison guards whilst on his way to court. Police made a 3-mile barricade around the moor, but they could never have known the unimaginable terror that was about to unfold. Like a scene from a horror movie, William Hughes fled across the snow-covered moorland to the Moran family's luxury Eastmoor home, known as Pottery Cottage, where he embarked upon his 55-hour reign of terror. Hughes picked up 2 axes kept outside for chopping wood, before silently creeping into the house. Before we start, I want to ask, if you enjoy my content, then please drop the video a like and leave me a comment below. It really helps the channel grow, and hit subscribe for more. Thank you. So who was Billy Hughes? William Thomas Hughes was born on the 8th of August 1946 in Preston, Lancashire. He was the first of 6 children. Hughes had little interest in his education. His academic performance was poor, and he was prone to antisocial behaviour and petty criminality, being first arrested at aged 14 for theft. He failed to hold down a job for any lasting duration after leaving school at aged 15. Hughes' escalating criminal behaviour resulted in spells in approved school and later Borstal. He received the first of multiple prison sentences in 1966, as the majority of his criminal offences involved violence. He gradually earned the nickname Mad Billy. In 1972, Hughes married his fiancée, Jean Nadin, who was from Blackpool, a mother of 1, whom he initially proposed to whilst incarcerated at HMP Walton. The couple initially resided close to Blackpool's Golden Mile and had 1 daughter, Nicola, although they frequently changed addresses, in part due to Hughes' reluctance to pay landlords rent. Initially, the couple's relationship was harmonious, although their relationship gradually became abusive, violent and marred with infidelity. Jean saw little of her husband. The following year, he was sentenced to 3.5 years imprisonment, having been convicted of 4 counts of assault, causing actual bodily harm, for violently assaulting 2 police officers who had stopped his car and discovered a cache of drugs in the vehicle, and assaulting 2 other police officers as he violently resisted arrest following a brief chase. He was released from custody in early 1976. Hughes abandoned his wife and child in March 1976. He later moved to Chesterfield with his girlfriend, Teresa O'Doherty. 5 months later, on the night of 21st of August, Hughes was about to go further than he ever had before. He followed a young couple whom he had met in a nightclub to a local park. He hid out of sight, but was waiting for them to become intimate with each other. Once they did, Hughes rushed up behind the man and hit him over the head with a brick, rendering him unconscious, before proceeding to drag his partner to a nearby riverbank where he essayed her at knife point. Following a public appeal, police received an anonymous tip-off, and Hughes was eventually arrested, charged and remanded to HMP Leicester on the 27th of August. He initially corresponded with his girlfriend O'Doherty on a frequent basis from prison, although shortly into his incarceration, O'Doherty terminated their relationship and relocated to a separate address in Chesterfield. As such, subsequent letters penned by Hughes to O'Doherty went unanswered. Despite his extensive history of violent behaviour, Hughes was categorised as a Category B inmate and allocated work in the prison kitchen, from where, on 3rd of December 1976, he stole a 7.5-inch boning knife, which he managed to keep concealed inside a small, fine tear he had carved in the base of his mattress, despite numerous searches for the utensil. During his imprisonment at HMP Leicester, Hughes did not display any unusual behaviour or give any cause for concern, although a report on Hughes was published which stated he was of a violent nature and may attempt to escape. This, along with the full record of Hughes's previous convictions, did not arrive at HMP Leicester until after his escape and the subsequent events unfolded. Arthur Minton and his wife Amy shared a home with their younger daughter Gillian and her husband Richard Moran. The two families lived in separate sections of the household, separated by a sliding door. Upon discovering they were unable to conceive, Richard and Gillian chose to adopt a baby girl in 1966. They named their daughter Sarah. At the time the family's paths crossed with William Hughes, Richard worked as a sales director for a Chesterfield-based plastics manufacturing firm. Gillian worked as a secretary for a firm of accountants, and Sarah was a content child and excellent student at her local primary school. The Mintons were both retired. Shortly after 7 a.m. on the 12th of January 1977, Hughes made a phone call to his ex-girlfriend O'Doherty from the landing of HMP Leicester. In this phone call, he taunted his former lover by whispering, "No one with you, I hope," before alluding to her efforts to evade him by changing her address. He sarcastically revealed that he had duped the Directory Enquiries lady into providing him with her new address. Despite this revelation, O'Doherty sternly informed Hughes that their relationship was over. O'Doherty also refused to appear as a character witness to put a good word in on his behalf. At a scheduled court appearance later that day, he briefly pleaded with her, claiming she was all he had in the world, before becoming enraged. As she terminated the phone call, he told her, "You better lock your doors." He then calmly entered the prison kitchen to perform his assigned work duty of washing cutlery. Later that morning, Hughes was driven from the prison to appear at Chesterfield Magistrates Court to go on trial for GBH and SA. Hughes was transported to Chesterfield via taxi, accompanied by prison officers Donald Sprintle and Kenneth Simmons. He was frisked, handcuffed to Simmons, and placed in the back seat of the taxi cab, with Sprintle sitting in the front passenger seat. The method of handcuffing upon Hughes meant that although he was handcuffed to another officer, he had one hand free. Initially, Hughes engaged in small talk with the officers. Then he insisted that he needed to use the bathroom. The prison officers allowed the vehicle to pull into a service station, where Hughes used the opportunity to discreetly retrieve the stolen boning knife he had hidden before allowing himself to be handcuffed to Simmons. Shortly after the journey restarted, Hughes attacked both prison officers inside the vehicle. He first attacked Sprintle, stabbing him in the back of the neck, narrowly missing his spine. before turning his attention to Simmons, who he slashed across the jaw and hand. After incapacitating the prison officers and forcing Sprintle to provide the handcuffs as he held a knife to his throat, Hughes forced the taxi driver, David Reynolds, to continue driving at knife point for a short distance before dumping him and the badly injured officers at the side of the road and commandeering the vehicle. Hughes proceeded to drive for only a short distance before crashing the car into a wall and fleeing on foot onto Eastmoor. Hughes' escape was helped by the fact that Derbyshire and much of the north of England was covered in snow thanks to the worst blizzards in 15 years. The weather would later hamper the search for him. Police were notified of Hughes' escape at approximately 10 a.m. The crashed taxi Hughes had been travelling in was located within the hour. The immediate search was led by Chief Inspector Peter Howes. At the scene, the police dogs were unable to pick up a scent. The heavy snowfall had already concealed any footprints, and there were no witnesses to the crash itself, as the roads were largely deserted due to the harsh climate. A search radius was immediately established to encompass isolated local properties, farms and outbuildings. Initial available resources were insufficient to thoroughly search every property in the area, so police focused on the most vulnerable to no avail. Investigators believed the most likely scenario with Hughes' movements were that he would continue towards Beeley, ultimately desiring to reach the A6, and it was considered unlikely that he would have headed onto the vast open moors in such treacherous conditions. There were fears that Hughes was on his way to his hometown of Blackpool, where his ex-wife, Jean, and their daughter Nicola lived. Quickly, police removed them out of danger. Unbeknown to the police, Mad Billy was still in Derbyshire, making his way over 4 miles of exposed moorland amidst a fierce blizzard, heading north across frozen fells, where he spotted a remote Pottery Cottage in the village of Eastmoor, a perfect hideout. Before we carry on, I would like to say thank you to Movie Hell for suggesting this case to me. If you are into horror movie reviews or just want to show some love, then please go subscribe to Movie Hell's YouTube channel. Thank you. Day 1, Wednesday, January 12th, 1977. North End Farm was a converted 18th century pottery barn on the edge of the Peak District in Eastmoor. It had been renamed Pottery Cottage. The Mintons were at home when Hughes walked in through the back door of the property, armed with the 2 axes he had retrieved from their shed. He informed the retired couple that he was on the run from the police, having stabbed 2 prison officers, and that he needed to lay low until nightfall. Hughes initially assured the Mintons that, if they cooperated, he would not harm them. Gillian Moran was the first to arrive home following Hughes' intrusion, arriving at her home shortly after 3 p.m. Approximately 30 minutes later, her daughter Sarah entered the property. To calm any fears in her daughter, Gillian told the child that Hughes was a stranded motorist waiting for his car to be repaired. The 2 exchanged smiles. Initially, the adults made small talk over a coffee, as Sarah, initially believing her mother's claims, sat on the floor and began sewing. Shortly thereafter, the child and her grandfather walked into the annex to watch television. Gillian later described Hughes' behaviour in the initial hours of her captivity as calm, even friendly. However, he became increasingly agitated as time passed, awaiting Richard's return. Richard Moran arrived home from a business meeting in Birmingham just after 6 p.m. to find Hughes holding a boning knife to his wife's throat, threatening to kill her if anyone approached him. He forced Richard to the floor and bound his hands and legs with flex cut from a vacuum cleaner and washing line, and then tied up Gillian and Amy with similar cords. Amy's distress drew Arthur and Sarah from the annex, with Arthur shouting for him to leave the family alone. Sarah blurted, "Don't you dare hurt my mummy and daddy, don't you dare." Hughes threw Arthur to the ground before dragging the resisting pensioner across the floor, placing him in an armchair where he bound him as Sarah sat terrified and mute on the floor. Despite his earlier assurances to the contrary, Hughes then gagged all the adults, whom he isolated in separate rooms, before taking Sarah through to her grandparents' bedroom. All 5 hostages spent the first night of captivity alone, bound and gagged in separate rooms of the Pottery Cottage. Gillian in her marital bedroom, Amy in Sarah's bedroom, Richard in a spare room, Sarah in her grandparents' bedroom, and Arthur in the downstairs lounge. At one stage in the evening, Gillian heard the sounds of a disturbance emanating from the lounge below and rapidly realised that her father was being beaten. Hughes then made tea for his hostages, holding the cup for Gillian while she drank, before proceeding to SA her. He then spent the rest of the night chatting to her husband, who was bound in an adjacent room, boasting of his criminal past as if he'd met Richard in a pub. Day 2, Thursday, January 13th, 1977. "Get up," Billy Hughes instructed as he came into Jill Moran's bedroom. She shuffled on the edge of the bed, where the night before he had forced her to perform an act on him as he untied her wrists and ankles. She was going out, he told her, to get newspapers for him and to see if there were any police roadblocks. As she did her hair, Jill gazed at her reflection in the mirror. She was bruised. There was a bite mark on her neck. Hughes watched as she dressed and started applying makeup. "Where's Sarah?" she asked him, desperate for news of her 10-year-old daughter. "Sound asleep. She's in your mum's room," he replied, speaking almost as if he was a member of the family. "I've covered her over." He said he'd also fed the dogs and checked on Sarah's pet rabbit. Suddenly, Hughes shouted to her to look outside. In the gravel courtyard, a council lorry was reversing, its sensors beeping. "They've come to empty the septic tank," Jill told Hughes. "Then deal with them," he fiercely said, "and act normal." Jill took a deep breath, went outside and spoke to the tanker driver and his mate. When they had finished the job, she signed the invoice and they left. She had desperately wanted to whisper something or write the word help across the paperwork, but she knew Hughes was watching from a window. If the men had reacted in any way, he would have seen. Jill walked towards the lounge and caught sight of her father, slumped in an armchair with a blue anorak covering him. He wasn't moving, and he was unnaturally silent. His artificial right leg protruded at a peculiar angle. She tried to go to him, but Hughes seized her arm and propelled her out of the room. Arthur was merely sleeping, he told her, but he refused to allow her anywhere near the lounge again. Hughes now made her ring the accountancy firm she worked for in Chesterfield and call in sick, which she did. Hughes next made her ring Sarah's school and her husband Richard's office, saying they were ill and wouldn't be coming in. The phone calls made, Hughes nudged Jill towards the front door. He unlocked it and let her out. "Get the papers and 40 fags," he said. As she got into her car, he said, "Remember, I've got your family here, Jill. Don't do anything stupid." "I won't. I promise," she said. As she drove 5 miles down to the village of Brampton, she felt a dizzying sense of disconnect from reality. Around her, people were just getting on with their lives. If only they knew what's happening at my house, she thought. Walking into the newsagents, she saw a stand of local newspapers with headlines screaming, "Dangerous hijacker still free, hostage fear." Her hands were trembling as she picked up the papers and bought cigarettes. She headed home through heavy falls of snow, relieved there were no roadblocks where she might be tempted to speak to police and put her family in danger. This was the first occasion that Jill was away from Hughes, with the opportunity to raise the alarm and get help. It would not be the last, all of which would later leave people at pains to understand why she kept silent. The search for an explanation even led to unfounded gossip in some quarters that she knew Hughes before his escape, and that there had been some sort of relationship between them. It was categorically untrue, said Chief Inspector Peter House, who led the hunt for Hughes. The fact is, she was repulsed by him in every way, but she felt she had no choice but to obey him, in the hope that he might keep his promise and leave. Back home, Jill went inside, but saw no sign of her father in the armchair. "Where's Dad?" she asked. "In his bedroom," Hughes told her, as he grabbed the newspapers and began to read. With his permission, she made drinks for everyone. Hughes went off to the annex, the separate part of Pottery Cottage, behind a connecting door, which was the grandparents' quarters, carrying a cup of coffee for Arthur and a glass of Ribena for Sarah, while Jill went upstairs with drinks for Richard and her mother. Richard was in the spare room, bound but not gagged. As they talked together quietly, Hughes appeared and ushered her into her own bedroom. There, he shoved her on the bed, told her to undress and essayed her again. When he had finished, he put on his clothes and went to the room Richard was in and spoke to him whilst prominently holding a knife. Later, downstairs in the kitchen, Jill heated some cans of soup. Hughes brought Richard in and dumped him on the floor. Jill looked down at her husband, appalled by his pained, exhausted face and the purple swelling of his hands from the flex wound tight around his wrists. She knelt down to help him eat, but he could barely sip the soup from the bowl she held to his lips. Hughes grabbed the whiskey bottle, poured a large measure, and made Jill drink it. He gave some to Richard too, and took some upstairs to Amy. He told them he fully intended to leave that evening, but until then, they needed to find a way to pass some time. "Have you got any cards?" he asked. And over the next couple of hours, they played rummy, and then Hughes tried to teach them a game called Chinese Patience. They also drank the full bottle of whiskey. At this point, Hughes made no attempt to contain his prisoners, confident that they were now tied to him by a far stronger bond, those of automatic compliance, a psychological state induced by extreme fear. They were all in Sarah's bedroom now, alongside the little girl's trophy she had won for sports at school, her cycling proficiency certificate, and the cot where her dolls slept. The room was calming. Sarah and her grandfather were supposedly on the other side of the wall, in the annex. Hughes gave assurances that they were okay. Mum had said to Billy a number of times how worried she was about Dad, Jill recalled. Hughes always replied that he was all right and that Sarah was looking after him. He said that Sarah was only tied with a pair of tights, and that neither was gagged. I had asked him why Sarah didn't call out. Hughes said it was because I told her not to. Jill found it odd though, that there was no sound coming from the annex. We never heard the toilet flush or anything, she said. It was strange too, that Sarah had failed to ask for her comfort toys, a rolled up towel and an elephant that she needed to soothe her to sleep. When Jill put this to Hughes, he said Sarah had never mentioned them. She's quite happy in there with your dad, but pressed by Jill, he agreed to take the items to the little girl. She was really pleased to see them. Jill took comfort from this, and from an occasion later, when a chatty Hughes said, "I've got a little girl of my own. That's why I'd never hurt Sarah." He passed Jill a photograph of his daughter, telling her how much she loved her. His words gave Jill hope for her own daughter's safety. What no one inside Pottery Cottage knew was that the police were close by. They had spent the afternoon working their way steadily down the road and reached the Highwayman Inn 200 yards away, where the manager had a newspaper photograph of Hughes propped up on his till. The search team checked the outbuildings of the pub, but found nothing and returned to Chesterfield. They never got as far as the Pottery Cottage. That evening, Jill begged Hughes to let Sarah sleep with her. "She must be so frightened. I want to be with her." Hughes shook his head. Jill herself was too wired to sleep. Her husband and mother were in great distress, but at least she knew where they were. Worryingly, she hadn't seen or heard any activity from her daughter or her father for many hours, and Hughes was still there, unpredictable and dangerous. Day 3, Friday, January 14th, 1977. The next morning, Hughes looked at Jill and Richard. "You two are going into town to do some shopping. I need a lot of things, so make a list." Jill felt Richard's body tense with anticipation. Here was their chance to raise the alarm. Hughes reeled off things he wanted in order to make good his escape. A gas camping stove, a saucepan, 6 tins of Irish stew, tomato soup, vegetable soup, 24 cans of light ale, a half bottle of Bell's whiskey, cigarettes, the newspapers, and a tin opener. He handed over £25 he'd stolen from them earlier. "And get a present for Sarah as well. She's been really good." "Thanks, Billy. You are kind." Jill forced herself to say anything to keep him sweet and increase their chances of survival. Through the snow, she and her husband headed off in the car. This was the first time that Richard and I had been able to talk together freely. Richard spoke first, his voice low and desperate. In the past 36 hours, he'd been bound and gagged repeatedly until every muscle in his body pulsated with pain. His wife had been essayed multiple times. He was terrified for Sarah, whom they hadn't seen or heard from in far too long. "I can't take it anymore, Jill. We're going to the police." Jill snapped back. "No, that's the very last thing we're going to do." To her mind, all the pain, fear and humiliation was born solely to keep the police at bay. An army of squad cars arriving at the house would send him haywire and see the whole family dead before the sirens had stopped wailing. Richard couldn't believe what she was saying. The police were skilled in dealing with hostage negotiations, he argued. "No," she screamed again. "But I've had enough, Jill. How can we take any more?" "Because we must," she answered fiercely. "And if you insist on going to the police, I will never forgive you. Never." He thought for a while, then agreed. "All right," he said quietly. Arriving in Chesterfield, they went from shop to shop, buying all the items on Hughes's list, and chose an Enid Blyton book as a present for Sarah. Back at the cottage, Hughes unloaded the shopping before telling Jill to boil as many eggs as possible as supplies for his getaway. While 13 simmered in the pans on the stove, Jill managed a brief talk with her mother. Amy was worried about Arthur and had asked Hughes if she could go through to the annex to help him, but Hughes had refused. Jill followed up. She was concerned that Sarah hadn't asked for any fresh underwear. "She's so particular about cleanliness," she said. Hughes said he'd take her a clean pair round. When he came back, he told Jill Sarah was glad to have them, but she made me turn my back while she changed. A wave of relief rushed over Jill. That was exactly the sort of thing her daughter would say. "She's all right then," she said gratefully. "All right," Hughes replied. "She's even got the radio on." And Jill believed him, especially after she cooked lunch, and he took 2 plates of food through to the annex for Sarah and Arthur. A bizarre domestic scene played out. Richard and Hughes drank some beer, and Jill washed up. Afterwards, they went up to the main bedroom because Hughes wanted to try on one of Jill's wigs. He stood in front of the mirror, grinning and saying, "I look quite sexy, don't I?" He then had a bath, leaving Jill, her mother and husband talking in hushed voices, feeling quietly confident that the end of their ordeal was in sight. "We didn't think of escaping. We just wanted him out the way," Jill recalled. "We couldn't take the chance of anyone getting hurt." But Hughes still needed money before he was able to go. There must be cash at the plastics firm in Chesterfield, where Richard was a director. Hughes decided they must drive him there. Hughes tied up Amy to make sure she couldn't get away, and they set off. Richard drove. Jill was next to him in the front, and Hughes sat in the back. He had a knife. Jill recalled praying that there was a lot of petty cash so that he would finally go. "All I could do was hope," she said. When they arrived at the factory, Richard reported to his manager that he was on site and going to his office to get some papers. The 3 of them went into the accountant's office, which Hughes ransacked, before taking 3 wage packets from the safe and a wad of notes and some bags of silver from the drawer. The total haul was £210. As they drove back to Pottery Cottage, Hughes was reassuring. "Don't worry," he said, "I'll soon be on my way." There, he told Jill to collect all his shopping together in bags. It seemed he really was going. "But you're coming with me," he said to Jill. She stared at him. "No, it's all right," he said. "I'll stop another car on the way, rob the driver, then take them with me. I'll leave you, your car and the keys." And Jill somehow convinced herself he meant it. As he tied up Amy and Richard again, Hughes assured them this is the last time. He even left the gags off and put a jug of water nearby. Then he and Jill left together. They had gone several miles when Hughes had another change of mind. He said he'd left the AA book of maps at the cottage and needed it. They would have to go back. Jill was aghast. "It's ridiculous," she shouted at him, momentarily forgetting the danger of antagonizing him. "We can stop at any garage to buy maps. For God's sake, Hughes, keep going." He shook his head. So they went back to Pottery Cottage yet again. There he went inside, leaving her sitting in the car, and trying not to wonder if there was any sinister reason for him insisting on returning there. He was gone longer than she had expected. Suddenly, she heard him call from the lounge window. "I won't be long, Jill. I'm going to see Dad and Sarah." Not long after, he appeared running towards the car and got in. She caught a wild look in his eyes. Before he leaned over to start the car, nothing happened. He turned the key again, but the car failed to start. A light was on at the neighbour's house, and seeing this, Hughes told Jill to go there and ask for a tow to get them going. Jill was panic-stricken. "I can't involve them, Hughes," but he insisted. "Make up a story, Tell them your friend is in hospital and you need to get her husband there. Go on, quick. Jill stumbled to her neighbours, the Newmans, and found Len Newman in the garden. It's me, Gillian, she called out. He thought she looked terrible. Her face ashen, hair unkempt, hands working frantically at the fabric of her coat. Her words came out in a tumble. Len, can you do me a big favour and give us a tow? I've got to run my friend's husband home. Len frowned. Where's Richard? Jill's voice dropped to a whisper, and she gave him a small, high laugh, patting him on the cheek with her hand. He's tied up in a chair. It's the man from the moors. He's listening. He'll kill us all. At first Len didn't understand. Are you drunk? He asked. Then the penny dropped. I'll get my car, he said, knowing he needed to get to a telephone because there wasn't one at his house. He went inside and blurted out what was happening to his wife, Joyce. Len left to go to his garage to get the car when he caught eye of Amy Minton in the garden of Pottery Cottage. She was leaning against the wall, pain distorting her face, before she dropped out of sight. Len armed himself with a spade, telling his wife they were in mortal danger. Then the two of them got into his car, tyres screeching, hurtled onto the road and away. When Hughes, impatiently waiting in the snow, saw this, he went berserk. You've told them, he yelled at Jill. I haven't, Hughes. I haven't, she screamed back. Then she gasped as she saw her mother staggering very slowly towards her. A gluttonous dark stain was seeping from her throat onto her blue housecoat. Mum! Jill's hysterical scream spiraled into the night sky. Mum! Hughes, who thought he had killed her moments earlier, ordered Jill into the snow. Police Chief Peter Howes, arriving home after his shift, got the call that neighbours had raised the alarm and officers found Amy dead in a pool of blood in the garden, with the bodies of Arthur, Richard and Sarah inside. Peter recalls, we got to the front of the police convoy, chasing the car through the icy roads, reaching speeds in excess of 80 miles per hour. At one point, Hughes lost control and crashed. Surrounded by police, Hughes grabbed Jill and held an axe above her head, threatening to kill her if I didn't back off. I tried to negotiate for 50 minutes, until firearms officers came. They had never fired a gun before, but they had the correct training. I was trying to persuade him to give himself up. He was demanding another car, and I thought if we could tempt him into the other car, I would have a better chance of taking him. He told Jill to get out of the passenger door, but she was terrified and refused to move. He lost control and screamed at her and me. He shouted, "Right, your time's up," and he went for her. I tried to stop him and dived through the window of the car. Then one of the firearms officers shot through the back window. It hit him in the back of the head, but amazingly, it didn't penetrate his skull. It just bounced off his head and made him more wild as he continued to fight. It took 4 shots to kill him. The final bullet went in at his shoulder, but ended up entering his heart and killing him. Jill ran out of the car, and apart from a graze on her forehead, she was physically unharmed. Both prior to and immediately after receiving medical treatment at the local hospital, Gillian repeatedly asked as to the welfare of her family, although police and medical staff delayed relaying this information to her. She was not informed of the fate of her parents, husband and only child until shortly after receiving treatment for her injuries. When police stormed the house, they found Sarah dead in her grandparents' bed next to her favourite doll. She had been stabbed several times and was killed on the first night. There were plates of uneaten food around her. In the same room was her grandfather, who also lay dead. He too had been killed on the first night. After trying to stand up to Hughes, he was beaten to death. They found Amy and Richard in the living room. Amy had managed to free herself and was about to untie Richard, but Hughes came back and slashed her throat and stabbed Richard to death. The joint funeral service for Richard and Sarah Moran and Arthur and Amy Minton was conducted at Birmingham Cemetery, at Brimington Cemetery, Chesterfield, on Friday the 21st of January 1977. Over 100 mourners attended the service. Gillian and her sister Barbara were driven to the funeral service in a black car, accompanied by a police escort. In efforts to distract the media, the women were required to switch vehicles midway through the service. A journalist conducted an interview with Teresa O'Doherty, who had terminated her relationship with Hughes, via telephone. In this interview, O'Doherty discussed aspects of her relationship with Hughes and her apprehension on learning of his escape from prison before stating, "All I can say is I wish to God it had been me and not that family. I really mean that." The responsibility for arranging the funeral of Hughes fell to the Home Office. Initial plans were devised for Hughes to be buried at Chesterfield's Boythorpe Cemetery on the 25th of January. However, news of this decision triggered fierce protests from local residents, who did not wish for him to be buried in the cemetery and insisted he be interned at HM Prison Leicester, with other inmates who had previously been executed at this location. Numerous local residents vowed to disinter Hughes's corpse if he were interred within the cemetery. Several residents refilled the burial site, which had been prepared for a scheduled funeral, before attaching a set of chains tied with a padlock to the cemetery gates and hanging a board signed by scores of local residents protesting the decision to inter Hughes in the cemetery at the location. These protests led the proposed funeral plans to be altered at the last minute. Hughes's body was later cremated. The service was conducted at the same location as those whom he had murdered. To Billy Hughes, good riddance. That's all we got time for in this episode. Until next time, stay sane.